Thank you, Sherry. When it comes to men and cooking, there are, I suppose, more than a few stereotypes. One of them is this: guys don't do any cooking in the house. If they do any cooking, they do it outside the house, typically at a grill. Well, that stereotype rings true at my house. I don't know about yours. And it's not that I'm incapable of cooking in the kitchen. I'm actually a decent cook. It's just that I don't. And that being said, though I don't cook in the kitchen, I do all the grilling that's done at our house. Now, the grill that we had, I had bought almost 15 years ago when I got my first house. And for almost 15 years, it has served me well. And it wasn't a big fancy grill. It was pretty basic, a few frills whatsoever, but it would get the job done. And so for 15 years, it has worked fine. Now, this grill had 3 burners in it, and the gas line going from the first burner to the second, I noticed recently that line had corroded to the point where gas was coming up through it, and so I've got 3 burners and then a hole in a gas line, and there's flame coming out of all of them. I just decided, I really don't want gas coming out of holes that it should not on this grill, so it's time to replace this grill. Anyway, so I went to Lowe's this past week to buy a new grill and kind of bought the newest version of what the old one was. No frills, pretty basic grill, but it'll get the job done. So I get this grill home, and the rest of the day I'm asking myself this: I wonder what I could cook tonight on the grill. What could I grill tonight? Now, the truth is this: I don't love to grill. I don't hate to do it, but it's not something I necessarily look forward to. So why is it that I'm thinking, what is it that I can cook tonight? Because I've got a new grill. And behind that desire is this principle at work. There is a part of me that is not content merely to have something. I want to use it. There's a part of me that is not merely content to have something. I want to use it. Now, that principle is at work in a varied number of ways in each of our lives. I wish, though, that I could say that it is consistently at work in our lives as believers, but all too often it's not. You say, well, I don't quite follow you there, Michael. Let me see if I can explain. If you have a personal relationship with God, then you have a relationship with one that you can absolutely and completely and implicitly trust, rely on, and depend on. You have one who makes guidance available, who makes encouragement available, who makes correction available, who makes wisdom available, who makes all of these things available. And besides that, it is not merely that he is capable and desiring to work in and through you. It's theirs for the taking. It's available to you, but too often we're not like me with the grill. It's there, but we just don't want to use it. Or for whatever reason, we choose not to use what's available to us. The Bible has something to say about this subject, and it's in John chapter 11. If you would look with me there today. John chapter 11. I hope you brought your Bible. If you didn't, hopefully you can find one in the pew rack in front of you, or scooch closer to a neighbor, because, again, nothing that I say today is important as what is said here. John chapter 11. As you are turning there, let me set the stage for you. The New Testament makes clear that Jesus' ministry was marked by the existence of real and personal relationships. Certainly he had relationships with his earthly family. Certainly he had them with the disciples, but at least in this one particular instance, we know of other friends that Jesus had. Specifically, this text mentions a group of siblings. It was 2 sisters and a brother, Martha, Mary, and their brother Lazarus. And Jesus is close to them. And now we don't know how many times before he had been to their home in Bethany. It seems that he's been there before. But all we know is that the 4 of these individuals know each other, and they all care deeply for each other. As chapter 11 begins to unfold, we're told that Lazarus has gotten sick. And we're not told any of the symptoms where we might be able to guess what it was that he was facing. All we know is that he's getting sick, and it seems with each passing day he's getting sicker and weaker, to the point that his sisters are concerned for him. His condition is getting a bit more serious. And so what they do is to send a message in verse 3. It says, the sister sent to Jesus saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. Now, so Jesus is out traveling throughout Galilee, doing the work of ministry. He's not there in Bethany. They send a messenger to go out and find Jesus and say, oh, Lazarus, he's back at home and he's sick. The anticipated response, the reason they're sharing this with Jesus is that they anticipate he's going to drop what it is that he's doing and he's going to come back then to Bethany and make everything better. He's going to be of help to Lazarus, to Mary, and to Martha. Now, when Jesus hears this, he says in verse 4, this sickness is not unto death, but that the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. In case you're wondering in verse 5 how close Jesus was to them, we're told Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. These were not just Facebook friends to Jesus. He had a real and loving relationship with them. But we're told in verse 6 that after hearing this news, he stayed 2 more days where he was. He intentionally stayed 2 more days where he was. After the passage of 2 days, he told his disciples, we're going to go to Judea again. And he says in verse 11, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him. Now, the disciples, hearing this, they think Jesus is saying, hey, Lazarus literally is sleeping. Jesus, though, is speaking euphemistically, and he's trying to be subtle in what he's saying. But the disciples don't get that, and so he says in verse 14, Lazarus is dead. Lazarus is dead. And so Jesus begins, 2 days after hearing the news, to travel to Bethany. And by the time he arrives, Lazarus is not only dead, but he's been buried for 4 days. So Lazarus is not just dead, he's really, really dead at this point. When Jesus is approaching the home, Martha, it seems, sees Jesus approaching, and before he can ever get to the house, she runs out to him. And you can imagine, especially based on what we're told that she says, there's a whole series of emotions that she's wrestling with at that moment. I mean, first of all, she's glad to see Jesus. She cares for him. She is experiencing grief because she still lost her brother that she's cared so deeply for. He's just died a few days before. But then there's also the emotion of frustration, even anger, because she says this to Jesus in verse 21, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. If you had been here, if you had gotten here sooner, Jesus, this would have had a different ending. Jesus responds with a number of statements. The most consequential starts in verse 25, where he says to her, I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, shall live. Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. And then concludes with this, do you believe this? Verse 28, Mary, at this point, noticing that Jesus has arrived, she comes out, and it's interesting. She says to Jesus exactly the same thing. Lord, if only you had been here, you could have done something. If you had gotten here, my brother would not have died. Jesus asks in verse 34 where they've laid him, which is to say, where did you bury him? And so they seemingly walk to where the tomb is. And Jesus demands that the stone covering the entrance to the tomb be rolled back. Hearing this, Martha says, Jesus, don't do that. Verse 39, Lord, by this time there is a stench. He has been dead for 4 days. Jesus, that's going to be awful. Let's not do this. This is a bad idea. And then Jesus says simply, did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? They don't say anything. But Jesus offers a prayer to the Father. And then with 3 simple words, he says, Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus comes back to the land of the living. All right, if you have been around the Bible or around church very much, you have no doubt been exposed to this story. You've either read it, you've heard it preached, you've heard it taught. You've been exposed to this, some of you perhaps even since childhood. You're very familiar with what we just went over. While that may be true, it may also very well be true that there is a question that you have wondered about what we read in this passage. That question, perhaps very simply for you, is this. Why did Jesus wait so long before he went to Bethany? He heard, but then he waited 2 days before he even left town to head back. It's not as if Lazarus died while Jesus was trying to get there. Jesus intentionally stayed where he was after hearing this. You've wondered that, and I think it's a reasonable question because we're told plainly that Jesus loved these three. He's not indifferent to them. They're not just kind of passive acquaintances. He loves them. And one of them is in dire straits, and the other two are heartsick, and the one who could make everything better does not go and make everything better. Why did he wait? Well, I believe that the passage actually answers that with an answer that you may not, at least initially, be entirely comfortable with. Look with me back at verse 4. When Jesus hears from the messenger that Lazarus is sick, maybe he expounds and talks about just how sick he is. We don't know. Jesus says in verse 4, "This sickness is not unto death." Now, that does not mean that he is not going to die. Jesus is speaking, saying that the end goal of this is not death. It has a different end goal. It has a different purpose, and that, he says in verse 4, is the glory of God. This sickness does not have death as its goal. It has the glory of God as its goal, as its end. When Jesus finally announces to the disciples that they're going to head back to Bethany, he says, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him. Again, if you're wondering if Jesus knew just how sick Lazarus was, verse 14 answers that, because his disciples are taking Jesus literally, thinking Jesus is going to go wake him up. But Jesus tells them, Lazarus is dead. And then interestingly, he says this in verse 15, "I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there." Guys, I'm glad I was not there, and you guys there with me to observe, that you may believe. That you may believe. When Jesus finally gets to the home, and Martha first comes out and she says, if only you would have been here, you could have done something. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus says again in verse 25, "I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die," and says, "Do you believe this?" When Mary says the same thing to Jesus, "If only you had been here, you could have done something." Jesus, after demanding that the stone would be rolled back, and after hearing the protest of Martha, he says in verse 40, "Did not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" Now, in what we have just reviewed, there are two words or phrases that should, if you're paying attention, should stand out to you. Believe and glory of God. Anytime that the Bible repeats something in a fairly short range of verses, that's a pretty clear indicator that there's something significant to that. And repeatedly, we see these phrases, believe and glory of God, used in this passage. They are significant, but what is their significance? Well, I think to understand their significance, you need to understand, first of all, what they mean. You say, well, I know what believe means. Believe means that you accept something as truth or as being true. As in, I believe Caroline loves me. I accept that. I operate with that in my mind as being a true reality. Now, that type of deduction is a cognitive function. It's something that's going on in your mind where you say, all right, because of this and because of this, I come to the conclusion that that is true. I believe that to be true or truth. Now, you understand that, but hopefully you also understand, if you're at all familiar with the New Testament, that believing in Jesus involves more than just saying in your mind or coming to a mental deduction, these particular things I believe are true. These particular facts in my mind, I accept them as being truth. It's more than a mental checklist. Belief in Jesus in the New Testament conveys more than that. Behind it is a confidence in Him. Behind that is a dependence on Him. When Jesus says to the disciples back in verse 15, he says, guys, I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there that you may believe. Was Jesus' goal that that the disciples would get to a point where they'd say, oh mental check, believe Jesus can heal, Jesus has power over. Was it simply, did Jesus have merely as his goal that the disciples would get to the point where there were more facts that they would accept as being true? I think there was more to it than that, wasn't there? The belief that Jesus was seeking to instill was not merely accepting that some things are truth, but coming to a greater confidence in Jesus and a greater dependence on Jesus. In fact, this is how I would define it. And so you can take it for whatever it's worth. In my own heart and mind, I think it to be worth something. You may even want to write this down. When this passage speaks of believing, when it speaks of believing on or believing in Jesus, I, in my own heart, believe that the best way to render that phrase is a confident dependence on Jesus. That believing Jesus is a confident dependence on or in Him. All right, so that's the first significant phrase, believe or belief. It's a confident dependence. The second phrase that is repeated is the glory of God. The glory of God. That's a more difficult phrase to kind of get our minds around because it's more ethereal. It's more difficult to grasp some concrete realities of it. But from my perspective, the best way to communicate what the glory of God is this. When we speak of the glory of God, we're talking about what sets Him apart from any and everything else. We're talking about what identifies Him as being unique and superior. With that in mind, understand believing and the glory of God are linked in this passage through a causal relationship. One, specifically believing, begets the other. The glory of God. Let me put it in brass tacks. A confident dependence on Jesus results in you experiencing and witnessing what sets God apart, what makes Him unique. It enables you to experience and observe what only He can do. You say, well, okay, Michael, that's nice. Maybe you would say, well, those are some things I might not have thought about as I've looked at this passage, this familiar passage to me before, but what impact or what consequences does that have on me in my walk with God, or more specifically even, what does it have to do with what's going on here at Gate City? Well, to answer that question, let me refresh your minds about what we talked about last week. And so whether you were here or not, we looked at a passage in Revelation chapter 2, where Jesus has some words about the church at Ephesus. And Jesus praises this church that had been in existence for over 30 years by this point. He praises them for a number of positive things that are going on. They are praised by Jesus for their hard work, their diligence, their commitment, their endurance. They are praised for their commitment to truth and biblical orthodoxy. He said of them, guys, you don't tolerate theological nonsense. And when false teachers come in, you guys sniff it out. And you don't allow wolves in sheep's clothing to perpetrate hoaxes and falsehoods on the greater congregation. He says to them that they are, in short, working hard, believing the right things. And I believe, quite frankly, because of that, they are doing all sorts of things. They are working, and they are working hard for Christ and for Christ's sake. And there's much that's being done in His name and is being done for His sake. That was all good, except for this one little problem. We talked about it last week. Jesus says, I've got this one thing against you. You have walked away from the one that you were to love most. And I don't believe He's saying, hey guys, you don't love me, that you hate me or that you're indifferent to me. I believe what He's saying is that you have walked away from me. It's not that they had the bad or wrong motives. It's not that they had bad intentions. Their problem was that they had walked away from Him. And they're doing all sorts of stuff in His name and for His sake, but they were doing nothing with Him. nothing with his power. Now, how did that happen? Well, I talked about it last week, and I believe it's very simple. After 30 years of existence, what started off as brand new and they don't know how to do anything. After 30 years of existence as a church, they'd figured out a lot of stuff. They'd gotten a lot of tools in their tool belt of belief and doctrine. They had a lot of skills in their wheelhouse of ability and how to create systems and structures and discipleship plans and strategies and how we do that, this, that, and the other. And I don't believe they ever made the intentional choice to do this. I just believe that systematically over time, they got good enough at some things, a whole lot of things, that they got to the point where they just decided, hey, we don't need Jesus' help anymore. They never said that. They never intended to communicate that, but they just got so busy in the goings on that they were doing a lot for him, a lot in his name, and a lot for his sake, but nothing with him, nothing where he was working through them. Consequently, we're left with this question to ask of the Ephesians. How much of the glory of God were they able to witness? None. The things that set God apart as being unique and superior, the things that only God can do, how much of that were they able to see and experience? Well, nothing. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't positive things that were going on. It doesn't mean that there were not good systems and good structure and good plans and good all of these projects that they had been able to accomplish. But what had happened was this. They had been able as a church to see, and certainly God had been able to see what they could do, what they brought to the table, what they had been missing out on, and what they could not and did not yet see is what only God could do. To even get to more basic brass tacks, they had a confident dependence, but it was a confident dependence on themselves, what they could do. You see what's going on here in John 11? Jesus is saying that a confident dependence on him, and that alone brings about what? Witnessing and observing only what God can do. Last week I shared with you what's been going on in my heart and mind, lessons that God has been teaching me in ways in which He's affecting me in my walk with Him. I described how I believe sincerely that God is leading me through a process that's restoring my focus and absolute need and dependence on Him, and invited you to join me. And many of you expressed your desire to join me on that journey in your own life. What you have heard this morning so far is the fruit of what God has been helping me to see. And all this has culminated in my heart and mind with two questions that I want to pose to you this morning. The questions that I feel like God has led me to wrestle with. And here's the first question. In my own life, in the living of my everyday life, what is it that I am dependent, consciously dependent on Him for? And I don't mean just the basic stuff about my heart pumping and my lungs bringing in oxygen. I mean, but in the goings-on of my day, what I do at school, what I do at work, what I do at home, what I do anywhere, in any given day, what is it that I am consciously dependent on God for? Second question. In the everyday life of this church, with all that's going on, what is it that we are absolutely and intentionally dependent on God for? In the everyday life, the business of this church, what is it that we are absolutely dependent on God for? As I have wrestled with those questions, I have also been weighed by the answers, because I can say in my own life, you may be able to echo these sentiments as well. The answer's been not a whole lot. Some days, even nothing at all. And it's as if I have looked towards heaven and said, okay, God, I got this. Because I'll be 41 in February, and I don't pretend to know it all. But after 4 decades of living, there's lessons that I've picked up along the way. There's things that I have figured out, wrongs that I know to avoid, rights that I know to pursue. And there's so much, most everything in my everyday life. I kind of got this stuff figured out. Consequently, counsel and guidance from God that I could have sought, I haven't. Temptations that I faced in where I could have asked for God's help and decided, no, I got this. I can take care of this on my own. Correction that I should have sought where I thought, no, it wasn't that bad. All that I've just kind of left hanging on the tree. Too many times when I needed something, I would go to somebody that had skin on them instead of talking to him about it. You been there? You in that boat? In this church, as I've assessed to the extent that I can, I see a lot of people doing a lot of things. There's a lot of busyness. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, there's genuinely positive things that have been and genuinely positive things that are going on. But if I'm honest, many things that I observe going on, I believe to be candidly done without any dependence on Him. So it may be a Sunday school teacher that teaches a lesson after hours of study and preparation. They've dotted their I's, they've crossed their T's. They've done everything they possibly can to prepare and then deliver a Sunday school lesson that is informative, engaging, and all that. But never once in that preparation stopping to say, you know what? God, I have studied to prepare so that I can understand what you have said. But God, for this to have any impact on the lives of those that I talk to on Sunday, you have to do that because I can't. I can be a conveyor of a message, but I can't be a changer of hearts. You can do that. And I'm asking you and I'm depending on you to do that. How much of that goes on? We come into this sanctuary, into worship services as part of our regular routine. And don't get me wrong, that's a good thing. It's a good routine. It's a good habit to have. But for so many, on such a consistent basis, I think we would, if we're honest, say we come into this place without ever saying this to the Lord. Now, we get ready on a variety of number levels. We make sure that our bodies are washed, our hair is fixed, our clothes are pressed, our socks match, and our lipstick is not on our teeth. We do all of those things in terms of preparation. But how many times have you spent time talking to God in advance of coming into this place and said something like this? Lord, for this to be of impact in my life, for me during this time to be able to express something to you that's worth who you are and what you have done for me, God, I need your help. I need you, first of all, to help rob me from distractions in my mind so that my focus is in the right place. I need you to work in my heart to make sure that what's in there is clean. I need you to work in here so that my ears are sensitive to you as you speak through a song, as you speak through your word, as you speak through a prayer, as you speak. So collectively, in the absence of that, what is the result? Well, some good things occur. Some positive things can be witnessed. I'd say candidly, we have seen and continue to witness that as a church. Individually, you might have seen it in your own life. Some positive things, some noteworthy, praiseworthy things occur. Beyond that, you have been able to see, and we have been able to see collectively what we can do, what it is that we bring to the table. What skill sets we have, what knowledge and insight and perspectives we have. But along the way, the greatest consequence is this. What we miss out is what God can do. What only He can do. If we are careful enough to consider and honest enough to answer, only in our own personal lives as individuals, but collectively, our life as a body, as a fellowship. I believe, quite frankly, what we have yet to experience is what can only be described as a real movement of God. Do you believe that? You think I'm right about that? I'm not saying that good and positive things aren't going on. I'm not saying that people haven't worked hard and to this very moment are not working diligently. All kinds of positive things. But what I'm saying is this. We have seen and God has been able to see what we bring to the table, but we have yet to be confidently dependent on Him enough so that we can see what only He can do. It's very different. Very different. And I believe sincerely that when we see and when we observe the glory of God, what sets Him apart, what demonstrates Him to be superior, what is only that which He can do, the difference will be unmistakable. It's not that He is unwilling. It's not that He lacks the desire. I believe, quite frankly, what He's waiting for, what He's looking for, is exactly what He was looking for in John 11. Confident dependence. A confident dependence exclusively on Him. I leave you with 3 questions, 2 of which I've already asked you. In the everyday living of your life, just think about stuff this week, just this past week. In the 7 days that are behind you in the rearview mirror, how many times were you doing something that you were consciously saying and reminding yourself, I am absolutely dependent on God for this? And what's going on in our church in the past week or the past month or the past year? What is it that we would say we have been absolutely dependent on God to do? Because do you see what happens? If we are saying individually and collectively, hey God, I got this, what do you think God's going to do? Nothing. He's not going to kick the door down. He's not going to barge in and say, well, whether you want it or not, here's my help, here's my power. He's just going to wait. Wait. Because when and only when we are confidently dependent on Him, then and only then can His glory be revealed. That leads me to the 3rd question. In your life and in the life of this church, do you really want to see what only God can do? Will you bow your heads with me? Do you really want to see? Are you hungry to witness and observe what only God can do in your life and in this church? Well, that doesn't happen by chance. It doesn't happen simply by coming to church or giving money or reading your Bible. It comes by you doing something where you express to Him. It's not a one-shot wonder, but it's a regular, consistent, absolute confidence and dependence on Him. Some of you that where you're sitting this morning, I have been where you have been in recent weeks. These truths have kind of shaken and upset my apple cart. Because I realized I've been able to see what Michael can do. But I've yet to really experience and witness what only He can do. And God's helped me to see it's not because He's been unwilling or undesiring. It's been because I've been too independent. I've been telling Him, I've got this. I can take care of this. But I've quit saying that. Do you need to say that to Him this morning? God, I'm through saying that. And I'm really hungry to see You do what only You can. Maybe you want to say that to Him about what's going on in your heart, what's going on in this church. Some of you are involved and committed in a variety of different ways, and you invest a lot of time and hard work and sweat and tears and attention, and you've seen, God has seen. We've been able to see what you can do. You've done some good things. But has your ministry, your area of influence, been able to witness what only God can do? It'll only change when a confident dependence becomes your new normal. As God has spoken to your heart this morning, maybe you need to talk to Him. Hopefully you need to talk to Him. You feel that need this morning. Perhaps you need to do that right where you're seated. Maybe it is that you want to do so kneeling at this altar. Maybe you want me or Shep or someone else to pray with you and for you. We'll be glad to do that. But if God has spoken to you, will you begin to move this morning? This altar is open. This time of decision is for you. Maybe there's something else that God is doing in your heart and mind. Maybe it is that He's shown you He's doing a new thing here at Gate City. And He's showing you, I want you to be a part of this. I want to be a part of this family. I want to be used by Him here. If that's the case, the doors of this church are open. Maybe there's something else you just need to talk to God about. This is your time. Father, we just want to say thank you for the truth of your word, because it is the truth. And it shows us the truth about ourselves. And sometimes, Lord, that's not comfortable. Doesn't really feel good. But it has a goal, and that's to affect us, to impact us, so that you might change us. Lord, I pray that we become absolutely fatigued and weary of seeing what we can do, and become absolutely insatiably hungry to see what only you can do. Help us, God, to have that question beginning to ring through our minds consistently. God, today, what is it I'm dependent on you for? Or how often, Lord, is it I'm saying to you, hey, I've got this, I don't need your help. So, Lord, as you've spoken to our heart, however you're leading us to respond, I pray, God, that we'll be faithful, for we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. I'm going to ask if you would to stand as Tom and our praise team lead us in the hymn of invitation. As God has spoken to you, however He's spoken, you respond.